The quilt was double wedding ring, white and pale green. I knew the stitching because his mother had sewn it. I had traced that pattern with my finger at family suppers since I was 9 years old, sitting across from him at the long table, running my thumb along the edge of whatever fabric was nearest because I was a child, and children touch things without thinking. Now that quilt was folded at the foot of a bed I had never seen before, and I was standing in the center of that room, 17 years old, counting the stitches in one square of the pattern because I did not know what else to do with my hands while I waited for my cousin to come through the door. My name is Amity. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and this is the story I have carried the longest. If you have ever had to look at someone you already knew, someone you sat beside at meals, someone whose laugh you recognized from across a yard, and force yourself to see them as something else entirely overnight, I would like to hear about that. You can leave it below. And if you want to keep hearing what life really sounded like on the other side of that prayer cap, you are welcome here on this channel anytime. There are things I need you to understand before I take you into that room. His name was Levi. He was 19. I was 17. We were second cousins, which in our district was permitted, not common, but permitted. And the bishop said the bloodline was distant enough that God would not object. Levi's father and my mother's father were first cousins. We had known each other since before memory, the way you know the barn cats or the shape of the hill behind the schoolhouse. Not chosen, just always present. He helped his father build storage sheds for English farmers, and he was quiet in the way that people mistook for gentleness. He had a scar across his left thumb from a handsaw that slipped when he was 12. I remember the Sunday he came to meeting with that thumb wrapped in white cotton, and I remember thinking he looked embarrassed. That is the kind of thing I knew about him. Not his thoughts, not his voice when he was angry. The surface details you collect about someone who sits in your periphery for 17 years. He was not a cruel boy. I want to say that clearly, because the story I am about to tell you is not about cruelty. It is about a system that did not require cruelty to function. Levi did not choose me any more than I chose him. The arrangement came together the way arrangements always did in our district, quietly, between fathers and the bishop, with mothers informed after and daughters informed last. My father owed money on the farm. Levi's father had land but needed labor, and a married son meant a daughter-in-law who could work the kitchen and the garden and eventually fill the rooms of the daughter house they were already framing behind the main property. I learned this arithmetic later. At the time, all I knew was that my mother told me while kneading bread one Tuesday morning in September. She did not sit down. She did not look at me. She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough and said that Levi Yoder and I would be published at the next church meeting and that the wedding would be in November. The flour on her knuckles. The way the words came out in the same rhythm as the kneading. As though marrying me to my cousin was another thing her hands knew how to do. I did not argue. I want you to understand that too, because people on the outside hear forced and they picture screaming, resistance, a girl dragged somewhere against her will. That is not how it works. Force in our world was quiet. It lived in the architecture of obedience that had been built around you since birth, beam by beam, until the structure was so complete you could not see it. You simply lived inside it. My mother had been told who to marry. Her mother before her had been told. Arguing was not a thing that occurred to me, any more than it would occur to you to argue with the foundation of your house. The Ordnung held everything. The Ordnung decided everything. And the Ordnung said that when the bishop and your father agreed, you said yes with your silence. But what I have never told anyone, not my sisters, not my daughters, not the first English friend I made after I left, is what I did in the 40 minutes between when they closed the door of that room and when Levi came through it. I have carried it for decades. And it is such a small thing that I was ashamed of it for years. Ashamed that it was all I could do. I will tell you. But first, I need you to understand the day that brought me to that door. The wedding day itself was a Tuesday in November. The air smelled like wood smoke and cold mud and the last of the chrysanthemums my mother had planted along the fence, their heads brown and heavy and bowing toward the dirt. 300 people came. They filled the benches in the main room of our house, which had been cleared of all furniture the day before, the way it always was for church Sundays. Only this time, the occasion was mine. The dress I wore was my mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist with straight pins because there had not been time for proper alteration. I felt those pins against my ribs for the entire 3-hour service. Every time I breathed in fully, the points pressed into my skin, 2 on the left side and 1 just below my right arm, and I began to breathe shallowly without deciding to, the way your body learns to make itself smaller when the thing holding you together is also the thing that cuts. The service was in High German, and the bishop spoke about the duties of a wife with the same voice he used to speak about the duties of a field in planting season. Yield, receive, bear, be faithful to the purpose for which you were made. I sat beside Levi on the front bench, and his shoulder did not touch mine, and I studied his hands resting on his knees. The same hands. The scar on the left thumb faded now to a white line. Nothing about him had changed. Everything about what he meant had. At the meal afterward, 300 people eating roast chicken and creamed celery and bread with apple butter, I saw a girl named Fanny across the table. Fanny was 19. She had married her own second cousin the previous autumn, a boy named Amos, who farmed 60 acres south of our district line. I had known Fanny my whole life. We had shelled peas together, hung laundry side by side, stood next to each other at singings, and said nothing important. But at my wedding meal, Fanny looked at me from across the table and held my eyes for 3 full seconds. She did not smile. She did not speak. She held my gaze the way you hold someone's arm when they are about to step off a ledge they cannot see. Then she looked down at her plate. That look is the closest anyone came to telling me the truth that day, and she told it without a single word. I did not understand what she was saying then. I understand it now. She was saying, I know, and there is nothing I can do. The evening thinned. Guests left in buggies, the sound of hooves on gravel pulling away like a tide going out. The older women moved through the house cleaning, their hands automatic, their voices low. My mother and 2 of my aunts went upstairs. I knew what they were doing. They were preparing the room. I had watched this choreography at other weddings, the way the bride's mother carries fresh linens up the stairs and comes back down without meeting anyone's eyes. I had watched it the way you watch something that belongs to other people's lives. Now the linens were for me. I stood in the kitchen drying a dish I had already dried, and my mother came back down the stairs and put her hand on my shoulder and said nothing, and I put the dish down and followed her up. She walked me to the door of the room at the end of the hallway. The lamp was already lit inside. The quilt was already on the bed. She squeezed my hand once at the top of the stairs, and then she said the only sentence she would say to me about what was coming. I will tell you that sentence later because I did not understand what it meant until years afterward. She let go of my hand. She went back downstairs. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, each one a little farther away, and then I heard the kitchen door close, and then I heard nothing. I was alone. The room smelled like cedar from the chest where the quilt had been stored, and kerosene from the lamp, and something cold coming through the window frame where the seal had cracked. I stood in the center of the room, and I did not sit on the bed. I could hear voices below me, muffled, the last of the cleanup, and beneath that the sound of a horse shifting in the barn. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs again, heavier. They climbed 7 steps, and then they stopped. He stopped on the 7th step. I know it was the 7th because I counted them as they came. The way you count thunder after lightning to measure how far away the storm is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then nothing. He stood there on the other side of that door, somewhere between the downstairs where we had been cousins and the upstairs where we were supposed to become something else. And he did not move. I do not know why he stopped. I have thought about it for decades, and I still do not know. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was gathering himself the way I was gathering myself. Maybe he was listening for me the same way I was listening for him. But in that silence, in the pause between his seventh step and whatever would come next, I did the thing I have never told anyone. The thing I carried out of that community and across 40 years and into this room where I am finally saying it out loud. I went to the window, not to escape. There was no thought of escape. Not because I did not want to leave, but because leaving was a concept that did not exist inside the architecture of my understanding. The window was small, barely 2 feet across, and it faced the north field where the last of the corn stubble stood in frozen rows under a November sky with no moon. I reached down and I pushed the sash up 3 inches. Just 3 inches. The air that came through was so cold it hurt the skin on my wrists, and it smelled like frost and turned earth and something sharp and clean that I later learned was the smell of the world when it has nothing to hide. I stood there with my face near that opening, and I breathed. I breathed the outside air in through my nose and held it in my chest and let it out slowly through my mouth. And I did this 5 times, 6 times, 7 times, and each breath was the same, and each breath was the only thing in that room that belonged to me. Then I did something I had never done alone in a room before. I reached up and I unpinned my prayer cap. I held it in both hands, the white organdy stiff and warm from my head, the strings hanging between my fingers, and I set it on the windowsill beside the lamp. My hair was still pinned beneath, twisted in the bun I had worn since I was old enough to sit through a full church service. But the weight of the cap was gone, and the top of my head felt bare and open and strange, the way a room feels when you take down a picture that has hung in the same place for years, and there is just the wall and the outline of where it was. I was not rebelling. I did not have a word for what I was doing. I simply wanted to stand in that room as the version of myself that existed before the prayer cap, before the dress, before the pins in my ribs, before the word wife. I wanted 30 seconds as just a girl with cold air on her scalp and nothing expected of her. I counted to 200. I do not know why 200. It was not a number that meant anything. It was simply the farthest I could count without losing my place, and counting was the only act of control available to me in a room where everything else had been decided by other people. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted the way I had counted stitches in the quilt pattern downstairs at family suppers when I was small. The rhythm steadied something in me. Not my fear. The fear did not leave. But the counting laid something thin and careful over the fear, the way you lay a cloth over a table that is scratched and damaged. The damage is still there, but your hands have something smooth to rest on. At 140, I heard a floorboard creak below me. At 178, I heard his weight shift on the stair. At 200, I stopped. I pinned the prayer cap back onto my head. I closed the window. The cold air stopped, and the room returned to its sealed warmth, the kerosene and the cedar and the stillness. I sat down on the edge of the bed, on the quilt his mother had stitched, the double wedding ring pattern that I had known my whole life, and I folded my hands in my lap the way my mother folded hers during the long sermons, not because I was praying, but because I did not know what else to do with a body that was about to stop being entirely mine. My hands were the last thing I arranged. My hands were the last decision I made. The footsteps resumed. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The door opened. Levi stood in the frame, with the hallway dark behind him and the lamplight catching the scar on his thumb. And he looked at me the way you look at a task you have been told is yours. Not with hunger, not with tenderness, with the quiet resignation of a boy who had also been placed in a room he did not choose. He came in, he closed the door, he did not speak, and I did not speak. And the silence between us was not the comfortable silence of 2 people who understand each other, but the silence of 2 people who have been given no language for what is happening. I reached over and turned the wick of the lamp down until the flame was a blue line, and then nothing. And the last thing I saw before the dark came was the pale green thread of the quilt pattern. The same green I had traced with my finger at his mother's kitchen table when I was 9, when I was 12, when I was 15, and did not yet know that the thread connecting me to his family would eventually pull this tight. Then there was only dark, and the sound of breathing that was not only mine. Morning came the way mornings do in an Amish farmhouse, with the rooster first, then the iron clang of the stove lid in the kitchen below, then gray light through the window I had opened and closed in secret the night before. I was a wife. The word had not changed, but the girl who had counted to 200 was someone I would not see again for a very long time. 3 months later, Fanny came to visit. We sat on the porch with a bowl of dried peas between us, the late February air raw and damp, our fingers sorting the good from the split. I wanted to ask her something. I could feel the question sitting in my throat like a stone I could neither swallow nor spit out. She looked at me once, the same look she had given me across the wedding table, and I saw her mouth open slightly as though she was about to speak. She did not speak. I did not ask. We shelled the entire bowl in a silence that held more truth than any conversation I had in that district for the next 11 years. Every woman in that community had her own version of that window, her own version of counting, her own version of a question she carried to the porch and brought back inside unanswered. I know that now. I did not know it then. What I knew then was only the quiet and the peas, and the sound of Fanny's thumbnail splitting each pod along its seam. My mother's sentence, the one she said at the top of the stairs before she let go of my hand. She said, "It gets easier after the first winter." That was all. Not cruel, not kind. 5 words that contained the entire inherited vocabulary of women who had no other vocabulary, passed down from mother to daughter like a recipe or a quilt pattern, a thing you hand over because it is the only thing you were given. She did not say it would be good. She did not say it would be painless. She said it would get easier, which is a different thing entirely, because easier means you learn to stop noticing, and learning to stop noticing is not healing. It is the completion of the erasure. Years later, sitting in a small office with a woman who had letters after her name and a box of tissues on her desk, I heard different words for the first time. Coercive control, identity erosion, the systematic removal of bodily autonomy so gradual it feels like weather. I did not cry when she said these things. I went very still. Because she had given a name to the thing I had been breathing around for 40 years, and the name was so precise, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room I had forgotten was sealed. If you are listening to this and you remember your own version of that window, not the same window, not the same room, not the same November, but the same 3 inches of cold air you stole before someone else decided what your life would look like, then I need you to hear this. That was not small. That was not nothing. That was the part of you that refused to disappear completely. The part that said, before the door opens and the counting stops and the world asks me to become someone else's purpose, I am still here. I am still breathing air that belongs to no one. You are still here. You did not disappear. Someone else stitched the pattern. Someone else chose the colors and laid the quilt on the bed and decided what the room was for. But the thread held because you held it. If these stories help you find the word for something you have been carrying in silence, then I will keep telling them. You can subscribe so the next one finds you. But more than that, I want to know, what did you do in your version of that room? You can leave it below. Nobody is reading over your shoulder here. The window is still open, 3 inches. The wind still comes through.